Journey in Consciousness. Robert F. O'Donnell. Prologue. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. The lamp was hung out in the Old North Church. Revere and Dawes began their midnight rides, and on the 19th of April, 1775, the battle for freedom began. The price was paid, freedom from tyranny was won, and the nation began. On the 19th of April, 1971, the author discovered the price for another kind of freedom. The freedom that comes with knowledge of the truth. This is the story of the events that led to that freedom, and, perhaps more significantly, to the awareness of the price that must be paid. George and I were on an airplane, returning from a visit to Virginia Beach and the Association for Research and Enlightenment, when a brief encounter with a troubled stranger provided the backdrop against which the whole question of consciousness came into focus. It was a short flight, giving me just an hour in which to re-examine my own experience, 1 hour in which I hoped to find the right thing to say. 10 years ago, I had been torn apart by the same struggle with rituals and doctrines now confronting our fellow passenger. How had I survived the anger and violence of my own crisis of faith? What were the principles involved? If I could just pick up and follow the thread of my own growth in consciousness, perhaps I could find the words with which to help him. Then a soul, the offspring of a creator, entering into a consciousness that becomes a manifestation in any plane or sphere of activity. Man, physical man and mental man, is a manifestation of consciousness. He has physical and mental, or human consciousness, which makes him aware of the sensate world about him, but in the spiritual sense he does not have consciousness, he is consciousness. Man, the real man, exists as a state of consciousness that is presently appearing in the earth as a flesh and blood body. This took some getting used to. I had always thought that I was real, you know. Now, let's see, I can see and feel myself, that's physical consciousness. And I can think of what I'm doing, have done, and will do, that's mental consciousness. Put them together and that's what you call human consciousness. Put them together with my body and you have what I used to call me, but which I now know as the appearance of me. This solved a lot of questions, especially ultimate ones such as the continuity of life. The CAYCE readings show that this same principle holds true for any plane or sphere of activity. Thus it is not surprising to hear that death in the material plane is passing through the outer door into a consciousness in the material activities that partakes of what the entity, or soul, has done with its spiritual truth in its manifestation in the earth sphere. Man enters the after-death state as another manifestation of the spiritual consciousness that he is. The human consciousness, man's interface with the physical world, gives way to a new type of consciousness. A consciousness having attributes suitable to the form man takes in what has been variously termed the astral, or spiritual plane. Whatever that form might take, it is evident in the CAYCE material that it too is only an appearance, another projection of spiritual consciousness into another plane of material activities. Like the human body, the astral, spiritual, or soul body is not really man, but man appearing as the form and substance of that plane of awareness. The nature of the soul body is given in the following readings. What one thinks continually, he becomes. After death the soul and spirit feed upon, and, in a sense, are possessed by that which was created by the mind in the earth experience. Whatever has been gained in the physical plane must be used. What form, then, do such bodies assume? The desired form. Built and made by that individual in its experience in the material plane. Regardless of the plane on which our consciousness manifests itself, of this we can be sure, that the nature of that manifestation is a function of what we do about what we know. Whether we are moving into a physical existence to begin a new earth experience, or out of physical life into the spiritual plane, the transit of consciousness is nothing more nor less than a moving from the time of planting to the time of harvest. Here is no jumping out of a physical body into some vague state of eternal bliss or misery, but a meeting of self to reap what we have sown. My own struggle began with this question of life after death. I found it impossible to resolve the idea of an all-loving deity with eternal punishment for temporal failings. If I, as a very human father, couldn't even begin to entertain the idea of punishing the misdeeds of my children with a lifetime of suffering, how could I believe in a God who would be infinitely unforgiving? Because I couldn't believe it, it became increasingly more difficult to maintain confidence in the church that said I had to. The crisis had begun. Limits of consciousness. No man can reveal to you aught but that which already lies half asleep in the dawning of your knowledge. What are the limits of awareness to which we may attain? For know, all that the entity may know of God, or even of law or international relationships already exists in the consciousness for the entity to be made aware of same. What, then, is the purpose of the entity's activity in the consciousness of mind, matter, spirit, in the present? That it, the entity, may know itself to be itself and part of the whole, not the whole, but one with the whole. More specifically, the CAYCE material tells us that the outer limit of consciousness, the ideal, the goal of man, is the attainment of what the readings refer to as the Christ consciousness. Should the Christ consciousness be described as the awareness within each soul, imprinted in pattern on the mind and waiting to be awakened by the will, of the soul's oneness with God? Correct? That's the idea exactly. Man's purpose is to know himself to be himself, yet one with God. Not become one with God, but become aware that he is already one with him. All that the Father has is already ours, residing in our spiritual consciousness awaiting its unfoldment. All the knowledge, all the health, all the wisdom, all the goods of the world are the Father's, and it is the Father's good pleasure to give us the kingdom. What is it then that hinders us? What is it that keeps us from realization of this great truth? Could it be that we have been looking for it across the sea, or upon the mountain top? Have we been looking for it in a book, a church, a creed, a teacher? If so, we have been looking in vain, because all that the Father has already exists in the consciousness for us to be made aware of it. All these sources may provide guidance, but the realization can only be found within. God is not withholding anything from us, He has placed it in our hearts that we might find it. It remains for us to open ourselves to receive it by acknowledging the presence of Christ in our own consciousness. What is it that hinders us? We hinder ourselves. It is only by our action in the light of what truth is known to us that we become free to move to higher and higher levels of consciousness, greater and greater realization of our oneness with the Father. The elevation of consciousness is really the elevation of self with respect to the standard of divine truth, an ongoing, outpouring expression of the allness of God, revealing Himself as your consciousness and mine. You can imagine how confused I was at this point. If the Word of God was in my consciousness, I certainly didn't realize it. What puzzled me most was how, if this heritage was really mine, had I managed to become so separated from it. The separation. All of which leads to the question of why there is a separation between knowing the truth and being one with the truth. The CAYCE readings show that man was created as a spiritual being, conscious of itself and of its oneness with the Father. This is the primal state and the ultimate goal of individual being. Individual spirit was consciousness without form or substance, in full awareness that its being and its power were God's being and God's power. With free will, there was ever the possibility that individual consciousness could choose to act in defiance of that which it knew itself to be. When that first thought came of self as being apart from God, as having power of its own, the creative power of individual mind brought into being that which was imaged, a sense of separation. Thus began the journey of the prodigal from his father's house. With each subsequent thought of self as a thing apart, the soul became less and less conscious of its oneness with its source and more conscious of itself as a thing apart. The separation was never real and is not real now, but so long as man persists in the illusion of separation, he can never turn and begin the journey in consciousness back to his father's house, back to conscious union with his source. Only when we realize that this sense of separation is an illusion do we begin to know the truth that makes men free. Then, when the first faint light of this realization disturbs our sense of separate selfhood, the consciousness of separation takes on new meaning. What, then, is the meaning of the separation? To bring into being the various phases so that the soul may find in manifested forms the consciousness, an awareness of its separation, and a return to itself, by that through which it passes in all the various spheres or stages of awareness. The distinction is subtle, but it is important to recognize the difference between thinking that we are separated from our source and knowing that we have a consciousness of separation. In one case we are living under and are subject to all the drawbacks of an illusion, in the other case we may, if we choose, make a conscious effort to place our feet upon the spiritual path of return. From the center of our being, our individual will would awaken us to the knowledge of what we are, to the realization of our Christ consciousness, that is imprinted in pattern on the mind. But will is under direction of the conscious mind, which has no desire to yield up its sense of separate selfhood. Mind is the factor that is in direct opposition to the will. Is it any wonder that enlightened teachers throughout history have epitomized mind as the slayer of the real? It was the activity of mind that created and continues to maintain the great illusion, the false sense of separate existence, and it is through the activity of mind that the illusion must eventually be dispelled. But it must be through the right activity of mind. Too long has man allowed himself to be ruled by the musings of the mind when he should have been the master, using mind not as a container to be filled, but as an avenue of awareness to the truth that is already within us. My human mind, in the early struggle between its ideas of God and those of the Church, said, "If there is a God, will someone please demonstrate the fact?" And so it was that in my crisis of faith I moved from one concept to another, never realizing that all concepts formed in the duality of the human mind serve only to enhance our sense of separation and keep us from the truth. Consciousness, then, is self, in the process of becoming aware of itself, as it unfolds toward its omega point through a gradual overcoming of the illusion of separation. That unfoldment can, according to the CAYCE material, be completed in this life experience. Knowing this, we can move on to examine the principles governing the expansion of consciousness. The expansion of consciousness. The same laws governing the movement of consciousness from one plane to another apply equally well to the expansion of consciousness in the earth plane. This is shown to man in the elemental world about him. Hence, as man passes through this material world, there are manifestations of the attributes that the consciousness finds coinciding with that activity which is manifested, hence becomes then as the very principle that would govern an entrance into further manifestations. Every form of life that man sees in a material world is an essence or manifestation of the Creator. Since any manifestation in the earth is in essence an expression of God, we may, through observation, determine the principles which enable or bring about an elevation of consciousness. What are the principles which enable a tiny seed to grow into further manifestations as a stalk, a bud, a full-fledged flower? As we observe the flower, we see the attributes of unending patience, the absence of thought for self, confidence and reliance on nature for substance. The flower does not think it is a flower, or that it is beautiful, it simply is. We see these attributes and we see that they coincide with the activity of the flower, the activity of growth toward fulfillment. You might well ask, what has this to do with man? It is simply that man, too, is a manifestation of God, one whose purpose also is to grow toward fulfillment. Although the fulfillment is different, the same principles which enable the simplest seed to reach its goal also enable man to evolve into higher and higher states of consciousness. However, more than observation is required. Man's consciousness of that about him is gained through that of which he, man, does about knowledge of that of which he is in relation to that from which he came and towards which he is going. The CAYCE readings emphasize that the unfoldment of consciousness toward conscious union with the Father is not a matter of the truth you know, but of what you do about the truth you know. The principles learned by observing the flower in its growth are of little value to us until we apply those principles in our own experience. It is only in the application of our knowledge of truth that we move to higher levels of awareness. In fact, the very perception of some of the principles governing growth is in itself the manifestation of a state of consciousness reached as a result of some prior application of knowledge held. It has been a long journey since the throes of descent reduced my faith to the vanishing point and restructured my consciousness into that of a Christian agnostic. Without any awareness of the principles involved, the action of my descent had moved me from the herd consciousness of blind belief and unquestioning acceptance into a new consciousness of self as an individual, a thing apart and free. But I only thought I was free. I had arrived in a brilliant manner at a wrong conclusion. Freedom. Oh, I was free of herd consciousness, but my freedom became the chains of a new imprisonment, because I had simply exchanged the confinement of one set of human concepts for the confinement of another. In considering myself not just as an individual, but as an individual apart from others, I proceeded to manifest the nature of my newfound consciousness by criticizing every institution, practice, and ritual of my former state whenever I had the chance. There were chances aplenty. Everyone who still affirmed what I had rejected was a prime candidate for attack. All of them, family, friends, acquaintances, and even occasional strangers received a full barrage. Was I good at it? You bet I was. I was so good at tying people in mental knots that after 3 years of practice, acquaintances were strangers, friends were acquaintances, and family, well, you know how families are. And it was very, very lonely. States of consciousness. How many states of consciousness are there? We might as well try to number the sands. Each state is different because it is arrived at as a result of individual experience and cannot be duplicated. Each state exists as a greater or lesser sense of separation, with its attractions as well as its dangers. When I discovered the phenomenon of Edgar Cayce and the philosophy that came through him, my isolation was complete. Those who didn't see me as an anti-religious iconoclast, partly true at the time, viewed me as an occult kook, also partly true at the time, and there just wasn't anyone with whom to share this new light. One evening as I brooded over my fate, my wife, Pat, called my attention to something I had overlooked in the ARE news. There it was, under groups in new areas, Whitman, Massachusetts. The very next town. I believe I set a record in getting to the telephone that night. Several evenings later I attended my first study group meeting, and it seemed like a homecoming. The consciousness of oneness with these wonderful people swept over and engulfed me, and I haven't been the same since. Meeting people who shared my beliefs ended my loneliness. It was the beginning of a new life of spiritual search, and the prelude to my introduction to the real spiritual problem of modern man. The attractions of any state are also dangers in that they tend to keep man confined to that state. Each step in the direction of expanded consciousness triggers opposing forces within the human mind, forces that must be brought into balance before we can move toward each succeeding step. The closer we approach a new level of awareness, the stronger becomes the desire to dwell in its light, yet the longer we dwell in any state of consciousness, the more blinded we become to the light that lies beyond it. It is in coming to this realization that man reaches the consciousness in the material plane of being aware of what he does about or with knowledge, intelligence, produces that which is known as the entering into the first cause, principle, basis or essence, that there may be demonstrated in that manifested that which gains for the soul, for the entity, that which would make the soul an acceptable companion to the creative force, creative influence. Thus we learn that states of consciousness are not to be sought for their own sake, but to be passed through on the journey to the Father's house. We must be constantly alert to the attractions of any state which would hinder us in our unfoldment, not because there is any power for good or evil in them, but because in the duality of our human mind they can easily reinforce our sense of separate selfhood. Although I didn't recognize it as a problem at the time, many in our group had psychic experiences to relate, and as time passed I became more and more fascinated with phenomena. I found myself seeking psychic power in the name of spiritual development. It was a real spiritual problem, because fascination with the psychic turns easily into dependence. Like Saul, I found myself seeking advice and guidance from the spirit world when I should have been turning to the Christ within. I saw that psychic ability could be sought, developed, and used for its own sake, and was blinded to the promise that all of this and more would appear as added things to those who seek first the kingdom of heaven within their own consciousness. Only by keeping our eyes fixed on the infinite can we avoid the entrapments of the finite. Only by acting in accordance with the truth we know is our consciousness lifted up. Only by lifting up the consciousness of Christ do we find the truth that makes us free. Free to walk unerringly the spiritual path to our Father's house. Epilogue. I suppose it was meant to happen this way. The sand of Virginia Beach was still in my shoes, my spirit was riding high from the uplifting vibrations of a weekend of spiritual fellowship, when, 15,000 feet in the air, a passing stranger brought me face to face with the ghost of my former self. I asked myself if it would do any good to repeat my own story, to tell him that I too had passed through the same crisis of faith that was tearing him apart. He said that he could find God as much in his garden as in his church, yet he didn't realize that what he said is the truth that could set him free. He didn't realize it and I didn't know how to tell him. George didn't know either. I saw the anguish on his face. He too realized that this gap in consciousness could not be bridged by words. I had always thought that helping someone was an easy matter when you had had similar experiences yourself. Should I have told the stranger that he was moving through a stage of development and not to worry? Or should I have shared my experience and told him that my own faith was restored because of a man named Casey who talked in his sleep? The unfoldment of spiritual consciousness is a journey that can only be made alone. This does not mean that we must turn our back on human love, concern, or fellowship, but that we must be prepared to give up our attachments to them and our desire to possess them. These are but the mirrors of the totality of divine love within each individual, and it is given us to seek their source, not the reflected images. When we have at last determined to put aside our desires and attachments, our sense of separation will begin to fade into a greater realization of our true relationship with all of creation.